And we're streaming.
Okay. Here we go. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Today we are here again for another session of the Slaveryarchive Book Club. My name is Ana Lúcia Araújo, professor at Howard University. This is a book club co-hosted by Alex Gill that I will try to spotlight him here. And also we have Vanessa Holden and Jessica Johnson, who are also our co-hosts, Jessica Johnson of Johns Hopkins University and Vanessa Holden from University of Kentucky. And today you are here to discuss this new book by historian Manuel Barcia. Then the book is just here. And the book is titled then The Yellow Demon of Fever, Fighting Disease in the 19th Century Transatlantic Slave Trade. This book was published then this year by Yale University Press. And as you know, as many of us were caught with the pandemic, we didn't have the opportunity of discussing this book face to face, but we are here today to delve in this book and also to celebrate the publication of the book. For those of you who do not know Manuel Barcia, Manuel is an accomplished historian of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade in the 19th century Atlantic world. He worked mainly on Cuba, but also covers then his work is transnational and comparative. And in his latest books, he worked also on Brazil and West Africa. And of course, this book that we have here is a book that covers the Atlantic world, either the North Atlantic, but also the South Atlantic. Manuel, he studied at the University of Havana in Cuba. Then he got his MA in comparative history and a PhD in history at University of Essex. He teaches now at University of Leeds, then since 2006, and he is a full professor and also chair of global history. In 2014, he was awarded a prestigious Philip Leverhulme Prize in History. This is a prize that is given then every year to researchers whose work has already attracted international recognition and whose future career is exceptionally promising. Of course, that this was a prize awarded in the past, and all this, of course, became a reality. And Manuel has been then a non-resident fellow at the Hutchins Center's Afro-Latin American Study at Harvard, and also a visiting fellow at the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University. And he's currently working on a new project that will examine Western policies to suppress piracy in the 19th century across the world. And he is my fellow member in the editorial board of the journal Slavery and Abolition, and one of the 4 editors of the journal Atlantic Studies Global Currents. And his latest book that we are discussing today, for those of you who are arriving now, is titled then The Yellow Demon of Fever, Fighting Disease in the 19th Century Transatlantic Slave Trade. And this, of course, is a topic that is very related to what we are living now with the COVID-19 pandemic. Then we are welcoming Manuel Barcia, who he's going to be talking for about 20 minutes. After that, those of you who are on Zoom, you can just raise your hand, and we are not such a big group, and even if you were, you can just ask your question orally. If you have any references or other issues, you can also use the chat. For those who are on YouTube and want to come to Zoom, you are welcome as well. Then, Manuel, now it's with you.
Okay, Anna, thank you very much. First, I would like to thank the organizer of the Slaveryarchive Book Club. I think that this is a terrific idea. I was telling Anna before, I think that it has really taken off, and hopefully this is something that can carry on in the post-pandemic work we're going to have. So I would like to thank Anna. I would like to thank Alex, Jessica, and Vanessa for having me here today. I would also like to thank all the people attending this talk on a Saturday afternoon, or there Saturday evening, or here, and probably somebody else from somewhere else around the world, who knows. Right. Well, first I should probably touch on what Anna was talking about a minute ago, and it's the timing of the book. Of course, I didn't anticipate that the book was going to come out at the time in which we will all be dealing with a pandemic that has taken over the world. We are all being affected one way or another, even if it is not in the place where you're living right now. You certainly know plenty of people who are dealing with the impact of this pandemic. For me, I've always tried to learn lessons from history, and for me, this has been a different kind of learning this time, because usually I have worked mostly on topics like slave rebellion, slave resistance, and these are topics that, of course, I haven't been able to experience myself. But with this, it's been a little bit too close to home. I think that many of the things that we are living today, things that I have experienced myself, can be seen in the historical record. The Nineteenth-Atlantic War is perfect for this kind of study. Stuff like, for instance, the cooperation that takes place among different actors, the control measures that governments, local governments or imperial governments are trying to implement, and that people are resisting or adopting, depending. Also, the way the medical experimentation and this medical trial and error dynamic is going to take place. All these things appear in the historical record, but also at the more personal level, I have also felt that anxieties and fears are very similar to the ones that I study over all these years while reading and writing this book. So I think probably I just want to say a couple of words about why I decided to write this book. This is a result of a long process. We are talking over 2 decades of work. When I started working on archives, one of the first things that I saw is that I could find plenty of documents that refer to the history of disease, the history of medicine in its relationship with slavery or the slave trade. And somehow I had this hunch of writing down things that I was finding as I went along with other research projects. And these bits and bobs eventually became like a big folder, and I started thinking that maybe I should do something with them. And the idea of writing a book came up when I had a discussion with an editor from Yale University Press. At the time, I didn't even know what I wanted to write about. I didn't even have a proper idea of what I wanted to do with it. But she was quite encouraging and kind of that threw a challenge. And I couldn't resist the temptation of saying yes. And here we are. For me, it has also been a great opportunity to do something that I wanted to do for a long time. As Anna was saying, I started researching on Cuban history from very early on, from my undergraduate days. And over time, I started working on Brazil, and then I started working on West Africa and West Central Africa, and eventually became more and more of a necessity to do interconnect histories to bring people from different backgrounds, different cultures together in the same narrative. If you wish, the sort of circum-Atlantic history that David Armitage coined. He coined the term about 20 years ago. So this was a great opportunity to bring all these people together. It was also sort of a challenge in the sense that I had to locate documents that were scattered all over the Atlantic, in different archives in Africa, Europe, and the Americas, as also documents that they were written in many languages as well. Most of them I was able to at least understand and be able to read them right away, but some of them I have struggled a little bit more with them, but still they made it into a book eventually after I had quite a lot of help from different colleagues, and I should probably acknowledge as well here the support of many colleagues who shared information with me, stuff that I couldn't reach, and I think it's worth mentioning this here. So historiographically, I had to pay attention to, I felt that I had to pay attention to this period, because when you do a survey of what we have in existence for the Atlantic slave trade, the history of the transatlantic slave trade, and specifically medical issues, you would probably come across, or you would come to the same conclusions that I came about, which is that there is quite a lot for the 18th century and less for the other centuries. The 19th century, surprisingly, whereas the 19th century usually is one of the centuries where you find more information about different things, for this topic and this period is not that forthcoming, and I always assume that the reason for the lack of published work on the history of medicine in the transatlantic slave trade in the 19th century is mostly related to the fact that this trade is mostly done in an illegal manner. It's done under the radar of different nations that are trying to abolish the trade at the same time. And even though there are plenty of documents, there is quite a lot of information in different archives all over the Atlantic, this information is not as forthcoming as it is for the 18th century. And very often, even the documents that we find are documents which were produced with the intention of never seeing the light, never being published, never being read by anybody but the people who were supposed to, people who were involved in this illegal human trafficking. So there were quite a few things that I wanted to do, and some things that I didn't want to do. I definitely didn't want to follow in this trap of offering this romantic narrative of the Western white doctor or missionary or officer or whatever that is often presented since the 19th century as a savior, as a hero, arriving in a place like could be described as a disaster zone or whatever you want to call it, the white man's grave, and arriving there and suddenly with this European knowledge or Western knowledge saving everybody. I try to stay clear from that, and one of the main things that I try to do is to bring African medical practitioners and also practitioners from other parts of the Atlantic into this history. This is not the history of white doctors or white men in general fighting tropical diseases, etc., etc. This is a much more complicated history, and I hope that I actually managed to bring other medical schools into the equation. And when I say medical schools, I refer to medical traditions from other parts of the Atlantic that are not necessarily those that inform Western practitioners that took degrees in the university, I don't know, Yale, Edinburgh, London, etc. The other thing that I wanted to avoid badly from the beginning was to offer this sort of Whiggish narrative of history, which a good medicine goes through a process in which it progresses through a century and new discoveries are made and things get better progressively, which is really quite far from what happened in the period. There were medical discoveries, there were medical breakthroughs, but it's not like they were done and immediately were implemented. Epidemiology, for instance, as a field of research, the medical field is going to actually become a proper field in this period, but that doesn't mean that it's immediately going to be implemented, and certainly it's not going to make it to the transatlantic slave trade that quickly, right? Diseases that were a common enemy for all the Atlantic actors of the period, and this is something that I actually tried to make a point of, to show how peoples who were from different backgrounds, African, European, American, they're going to come into contact in what Mary Louise Pratt refers to as contact zones, spaces of colonial encounter. And in these places, they are going to be often confronting each other. They are going to be fighting each other. But when it comes to fighting disease is a common enemy they all have, right? So they have to come together. They have to share information. They have to share knowledge. They have to share medical practices that actually inform each other. And one of the basic conclusions that come out of this is that slave trade surgeons or medical practitioners, they had the state-of-the-art knowledge of medicine, of what was going on at the time, that was comparable to that of those who were coming from Europe, directly from medical schools in the top universities in Europe. So this is quite clear, actually. So basically, the transatlantic slave trade, this massive, gargantuan human trafficking that is going to take place over 400 years, is going to create, by enforcing the removal and displacement of entire populations, is going to lead to the dissemination of disease across the entire Atlantic basin, right? We are all here familiar with the Columbian Exchange concept and everything else that has been built around. But this is actually even more complex in the sense that the trafficking of human beings across the Atlantic is actually going to also lead to the exchanges of merchandise, exchanges of body fluids, and of course diseases, right? Right. So for me, focusing on how these Atlantic actors interacted in these contact zones, which I refer to as slave trade contact zones, to actually kind of make them a tiny little bit different from what Marie-Louise Pratt meant when she coined this term about 20 years ago. And I try to show how they how these Atlantic actors exchange knowledge, fragmentary medical knowledge, if you want to quote to use the phrase of Pablo Gomez, historian Pablo Gomez. And by doing this, by looking at these exchanges, I realized that it was possible to see the ways in which medical cultures all across Atlantic are going to be changing, constantly changing during the period. That doesn't mean they're going to be progressing. Again, it's a point that I think is worth making. Another point that comes out of this that I think is important to make here is that, and this was an unsuspected result for me as a researcher, but I think it was also for those who were trying to abolish the slave trade at the time, is that the implementation of abolition in the Atlantic Basin, taking abolitionist ideas into practice, actually resulted in quite an increase of human suffering, especially of those Africans who were being trafficked across the Atlantic. And anyone who reads the book will see quite a lot of evidence about this, but it also resulted in even more experimentation at the time. So this is a period in history that medical historians refer to as the age of heroic medicine. And I have this phrase that I mention very often, although I never wrote it in the book, but I was quite fearful that I could be crucified for doing so. But I usually refer to what happened in the slave trade during this period as the age of heroic medicine on steroids, right? The level of medical experimentation here is off the charts, even when compared to places where there was very little control in Europe and the Americas. So basically, I consider that these interactions, while they allow us to see how medical cultures change throughout the period, they also allow us to see how this knowledge that is being generated, how these practices, sometimes they're even surgical practices, are going to become part of the materia medica of the time, and even until today, they are part of the medical corpus that we have inherited from 19th century ancestors across the land. So how do I do that? I have to hurry up, and I'm taking a lot of time. So I look at 4 stages of the process: so prophylaxis, diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment. I'm happy to expand on each of them if somebody has questions. I just want to mention here the prophylaxis, for instance, was quite important. And I think that I would like to say a couple of words about it, because we are all living through a process of prophylaxis at the time. Stopping COVID from spreading entire populations is prophylaxis to a certain extent. So this is a period in which you have miasma theory, which basically was an environmental theory that claimed that the environments were poisonous, lethal, and that they needed to be cured, they needed to be sanitized, just as human beings were. We had the humoral theory, which was the theory of the four humoral fluids in the body. It's an ancient Greek, ancient Roman theory that pertain blood, black and yellow bile, and phlegm. We have a homeopathic theory as well during the period, and during that period was much more successful than what it is today. If you think the therapies of the period were basically based on three signposts. One of them was bloodletting, the other one was the taking of purgatives, and finally they were the mercurial drugs, which were poisonous. So the homeopathic method at the time very often actually was much better. They had much better results than the official medicine coming out from medical schools. And also the prophylaxis allowed people to implement social measures, to do social engineering, to do public policy and public policing. So all these things are going to be part of the story that I'm telling in this book. And finally, also related to prophylaxis, but this is much later in this period, actually the very end of the period that I'm looking at, germ theory is going to make an appearance. But again, because this is not a process, a Whiggish process in which one thing leads to another, and there is medical progress in front of your eyes. Yes, there are going to be breakthroughs when it comes to germ theory. Young Snow, not the Young Snow from that series that I never remember the name, but a medical doctor from London, he's actually going to discover that, or at least he's going to claim that cholera is produced by contaminated water and that there are microorganisms. So this is all going to happen. And then, of course, Pasteur, Koch, they're going to come. So I look at these at three specific contact zones. And again, I'm going to be very quick here. And the number one is the slave ships and slave factories. I actually tried to look at how the medical conditions, medical knowledge, exchange of this medical knowledge and medical practice take place in slave ships and slave factories, which of course, even though they had state-of-the-art knowledge, that didn't mean that they had state-of-the-art supplies or facilities. If anything, they were at the back of the queue. I also look at the anti-slave trade patrols, which is basically ships, the ships that were trying to abolish the slave trade, which were the front line, if you wish, of containing these diseases. They are the ones who are going to capture, to seize the slave ships, and the first ones who are going to come into contact with ill ships, entirely ill ships. And then I also look at anti-slave trade reception centers, which are going to be set up across Atlantic by different nations to receive the crews and the enslaved men, women, and children that are going to be in the ships. In these cases, because they were legal, usually they had state-of-the-art facilities. The infrastructure was much better than in the other two cases. They had also medical provisions and medical supply were of the first rate very often, not always, but very often. And of course, they also had medical practitioners that have been educated in Europe or in America somewhere. So to start concluding here, just the findings, my findings of this in this project are first of all, the cooperation, learning, exchanging, experimentation are all going to be a common feature of the transatlantic slave trade in the 19th century. And they are so because they can be. It's an illegal war in which anything goes. In particular, they were crucial for these changes in medical cultures. And they were deeply affected, or determined, if you wish, by the knowledge and practices of men and women who were not Westerners, who were not European or Americans, right? And this is a very important knowledge. The knowledge of botany they have, but also the surgical knowledge they have very often is adopted by Europeans without much hesitation very often, actually. And well, I also conclude that medical knowledge is a weapon of sorts, if you think about it. And I think this comes across quite clear in the book as well. I mean, what Alison Bashford has referred to as the lines of hygienic containment, they are going to turn, as the century moves forward, the century goes by, they are going to turn into boundaries of rule. They are going to turn into European, colonial boundaries of rule, although the United States also have Liberia in Africa, and they are going to do so either through persuasion, through treaties, through trade, or through gunboats. But one way or another, they are going to allow for European and Western expansion in Africa. So there is this need for hygienic containment is going to hit an expansionist agenda, right? And this is quite apparent from the sources. This agenda is going to manifest itself in the access to new markets. There is a need to access to new markets, and you can look at the 19th century history of European expansionism, and you will see that this need for new markets, a free market doctrine of the time, is always going to be piggybacking abolitionist policies. It's also going to manifest itself through the control of populations and through territorial expansion, all three. So I would think that the things that I have learned from this book, and I'm finished with this, I promise you, is that, and these are learnings that I would like to share with you, because we are living through a pandemic, all of us, without an exception. Is the first one is a cooperation in the face of a common enemy is key to fight against this common enemy. Probably walking away from the World Health Organization is not a good idea. What it concerns to us, breaking off from the European Union probably is not a good idea either, especially not during a pandemic. We could learn quite a lot from our ancestors in the 19th century, slave traders and anti-slave trade patrols cooperating with the Africans, cooperating as well. There was quite a lot of cooperation. I think it's important that caring for each other is also highlighted here, because caring for each other quite often requires sacrifices. And again, if you look at this book, you will see that our ancestors were more often than not very willing to make sacrifices so that epidemic could be stopped, etc., etc. Sacrifices that we don't see as a consensus today. And finally, and this is my last sentence, I really think that if there is one thing that we could learn from our ancestors is that it's the absolute necessity of following scientific advice, right? They did it. They were always trying to be up to date with what was going on in the world of science, and this actually distinguished them from us today more than anything else, I think, in the world we are living in, the internet world that we're living in. So that I'm going to leave it there, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Manuel. And now we can then have your questions. Who does want to start? Then I will be forced to start, perhaps. Okay. Tatiana. Okay, Tatiana, go ahead. Let me just add you to the spotlight and go ahead. Okay.
Okay, sorry about that. Gracias, Manuel. Mucho gusto verte, como siempre. I love your work, as you know. I am writing a chapter now about barber surgeons in Mexico City. And I've been trying to use the Protomedicato records in a creative way. And I wondered if you could kind of maybe discuss with us some of the very kind of institutional sources that you use to write this history about people from below.
Yeah, thank you very much, gracias. Well, I think that I really work with a huge amount of sources and that which were quite different, because I was working with sources from different empires and colonial powers and other regions, actually, which were lawless regions. So not all the sources were always institutional, but when the sources were institutional, they were not necessarily medical sources per se. I did work with Protomedicato records from 2 or 3 places, but again, they were very focused and very limited to dealing with specific diseases at the time. So for instance, for yellow fever, I found quite a lot of this kind of sources produced by medical doctors, for medical doctors, for the power to see. More often, what I found that I thought it was quite relevant and it can be of help here is that authorities are always going to be discussing the next steps whenever there is a disease attacking them. So, and you can see this visually in anywhere in the Atlantic at the time. Whenever there is a disease in the horizon, especially if there is an epidemic disease, they are taking every kind of measure they can to stop the disease from arriving. So quarantines, self-isolation, bills of health. Every ship is going to carry a bill of health. They are also going to provision their colonies or whatever they are with as much medicine and as much medical provisions and with a state-of-the-art infrastructure wherever possible. But in reality, what they are really going to do is they're going to discuss. They're going to discuss constantly what is happening, and this you can almost see how but you can actually see in sources like, for instance, the city council records in any city in the Atlantic. There are always discussions about how disease is spreading, how disease must be stopped, etc., etc. So I guess that for Mexico City wouldn't be much more different. My suggestion probably would be to look into sources that are not classic medical sources.
Of course.
That's because, you know, for instance, with epidemic, it's quite curious because epidemics are extraordinary events, right? So in 30, 40, 50 years, actually longer than that, people will be talking about 2020 as a year of the pandemic. Like we still talk about 1918, right? Because it was an extraordinary event, but people continue to die in 1919, 1920, 1921, 1922. There were people dying of this flu that for some reason is being called the Spanish flu, even though it started in Belgium. So, you know, there is so much more outside of what we would normally consider as the most logical sources to go. Extraordinary events, they create all kinds of reactions across the world, and you can see these reactions in documents. But also ordinary events are going to create this reaction. The problem is that they are more difficult to find, but they are also in all kinds of official and non-official documents.
Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. Thank you, Tatiana. Do we have another question?
Yeah, I'm saying.
Or comment? Okay, then let me just, I will have one. Then there are two?
In the chat, yeah. There's one by Mary.
Okay, then let's see. Let's go with the chat then.
Yeah.
Okay, let me just, where is Manuel here? Let me put Manuel. Okay, there are two indeed in the chat. Three.
Already.
Okay,
Four,
I will start
actually.
with Mary. Mary, do you want to ask this orally?
Sure.
Yes, you can. Okay.
Yeah, so my question is also about method and sort of following up on Tatiana's question. So you discussed the records of the illegal slave trade as not forthcoming. So I was just wondering, I also use these records in my own research. So I was just wondering, how did you use records that are rife with, you know, misrepresentations, if not outright falsehoods, frequently? How did you work with those sources?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mary. And good to see you, by the way. Well, you have to question everything you read when it comes to an illegal business, right? Because they are always trying to hide things. And when I say they, I don't refer only to the slave dealers. I refer to everybody in this business because everybody has something to hide. You have to remember here that the crews and the captains and the surgeons of British ships engaged in abolishing the slave trade are actually making a killing out of it. They are making money from every ship they capture and from every African they liberate, right? So this is important to take into consideration as well, because they can also and they also screw up sometimes, you know, and they try to cover the tracks as well, and you can see this sometimes. So as per usually, you know, you do what the historian would normally do. You try to compare different sources and see whether they all say the same thing. You try to. I think that is very, very difficult to make sure that specific singular event is always correct. I mean, you can read between the lines and all that, but there is there is a lot more here, but you can actually see processes or places, how places evolve over time, or they change over time. For instance, illegal slave trade spots in the African coast, they move from one place to another. The slave dealers, they replace each other, they are dying often. And the same you can see in different posts across the Atlantic. And you can see, I really didn't set out to see whether everything that I was reading was true. This was never my intention, but trying to see to what extent what I'm reading is actually going to inform what seems to be logical, right? And no one has said before. And I think that this is, it makes more sense to do this kind of reading of the sources, because again, it's, you know, to a certain extent, if you find a bunch of letters from slave traders to the partners on the other side of Atlantic, and these letters were seized by a British ship, for instance, it is possible that these letters are telling the truth, right? And this is an assumption. It's a you know, logical assumption, and yet it's not always the case. I mean, logbooks are completely, from the first letter to the last one, they're falsified, because they have fake logbooks and fake letters to give the British when they captured them. You know, everything here is planned, and why wouldn't they? So it's you have to be critical. You know, the stuff that we have been taught.
Thank you, Manuel. And then we have more questions that, let's see. Mary already asked her question. And then we have Alex Ward saying that she cannot. Okay, now you can raise your hand. Then let me just replace you with. Okay, go ahead, please.
Hi, Manuel. Thank you for your presentation. As you know, I'm particularly interested in the group of liberated Africans, and for this reason, I was really interested in chapter 3, talking about like the anti-slave trade patrols. You touched on it just a bit in the last answer, but I was just wondering whether you think that it could be argued that on these anti-slave trade patrols, there was almost less incentive to keep these Africans alive. So would you argue that in a way, in the illegal trade, the care might have been better, or there might have been more, I guess, more incentive to keep them alive? I hope that makes sense.
Thanks, Alex. My guess is that everybody, or most of people, would do the best they could to keep people healthy and alive. And you can see this from the correspondence of officers across Atlantic from every nation involved one way or another on either side of this conflict. And you can see it in what crews and captains do. It's something as basic as this. If an epidemic breaks out in a ship in which you're carrying Africans, you are likely to get sick as well. So it is in your best interest not to have a smallpox going around. So it's really that simple. But there is also a financial incentive associated with all this. Healthy Africans were likely to earn people money, either arriving as enslaved men, women, and children in the Americas, or as liberated Africans elsewhere. There was always a financial incentive associated with it. So you would think as well that this was the case. But having said that, and this is something that hasn't been studied as much as I would like, not for the 19th century anyway. We have fantastic books for the 18th century. I'm thinking about Sowande Mostaking's book. I'm thinking about Stephanie Smallwood's book. But for the 19th century, we really don't have an in-depth study of the brutalities that take place in the transatlantic slave trade. And that make you wonder, why would people, including anti-slave trade patrol crews, behave in such a terrible way towards Africans? So there is an argument to say that, to a certain extent, in most cases, people are going to try to keep the Africans alive and healthy, because this means making money beyond whatever moral outlook of the world they may have. Also, they keep themselves healthy as well. But there are exceptions, and there are not few exceptions. There are quite a few, actually, quite a lot.
Thank you, Manuel. Thank you, Alex. We have then another question here. I will try to find it. Okay, from Danielle. Danielle Terrazas Williams. Danielle, do you want to ask a question?
Sure. Thank you so much, Ana Lucia, and thank you, Manuel, for your talk and presentation of the core elements of your book. I haven't had a chance to read it just yet, but I look forward to it shortly. So my question was about this particular lens of yellow fever. And so in the chat, I sort of posited, was it something about the virulency of yellow fever or the death rates that drew the attention of early modern doctors and officials in a way that, for example, malaria did not, or smallpox did not? What was it about this particular moment in the 19th century that yellow fever served such a strong lens to consider Atlantic slavery?
Thanks a lot, Danielle. Well, first of all, during this period, we already know that there was a vaccine for smallpox. Some slave traders were actually vaccinating the Africans already before embarking them. For instance, all the diseases that were either completely out of the reach or they could not understand them. I mean, malaria is a term that comes after. It shows up after. And it is practically impossible, at least for the medical practitioners of the time, to separate people who are suffering from fevers, right? Nosology is central for medical practitioners. And also for the people who are sick, obviously. If you have ever been sick and you have gone to your doctor and you have asked, what is it, what I have? And they say, let's carry a few tests. And then you go and you have your tests and they come back and they say, we don't know what you have. Then you get nervous, right? Yeah. Then you're, oh, probably it's a cancer. So when you pass 40, this is always the first thought that comes to your head. Anyway, the thing is that for these people, even separating common fevers from, say, typhoid, typhus, which actually they are called typhus and typhoid because they are quite similar, malaria fevers, etc., is a problem. And this gets even worse if you think how they are going to treat these fevers. Because as I said before, they have the pillars of the treatment are bloodletting, purgatives, and mercurial drugs. But in the 19th century, people start figuring out, A, that these treatments are not working very well, and B, they're killing people, basically, and B, that the sulfate of quinine, or the Peruvian bark, actually helps patients with some of these fevers. The problem is that they cannot tell which ones in particular, right? Because they cannot separate malaria fevers yet from these other fevers. So they start giving quinine to everybody, although this is a process. And of course, those who were giving quinine and had one of the 4 types of malaria, they tended to get better. But those who were giving quinine, which is very difficult to take, the body struggles to take it, and they had typhoid, they would probably die or get worse. So it was really a hit and miss, trial and error dynamic that put the practitioners, on the edge, and also the people who were suffering. Now, yellow fever, to answer your question, first of all, disclaimer here: the book is not about yellow fever, even though the title may otherwise suggest that, broadly. Yellow fever is going to be always in Africa, and this I had quite an interesting discussion with Guy Human the other day about this, and it's yellow fever, this idea that Africans don't suffer yellow fever, and of course Africans catch yellow fever just as anybody else. The thing is that yellow fever is endemic across many parts of Africa in the 19th century. They catch yellow fever when they're children. They die when they're children if they get it badly. And then you develop an immunity for the rest of your life. So the adults are being taken into the transatlantic slave trade. Most of the time, they had already suffered from yellow fever. So you find medical doctors on the other side of the Atlantic saying, I've never seen an African suffering from yellow fever, not even in the middle of an epidemic. There are reasons for that. There is actually a pretty logical and straightforward explanation for that. But yellow fever epidemics are going to freak out everybody else who had no immunity to a yellow fever, just as cholera or the bubonic plague would do, because they did not know how to deal with the yellow fever. There was no treatment for the yellow fever. They could not figure out how it was transmitted. So they for instance, whenever there was a yellow fever, there were quarantines. But obviously, for a quarantine against yellow fever to work, you have to separate the population that is already infected from the population that is already healthy, which in itself is a challenge, and place them beyond the range of the mosquito, the Aedes aegypti, the range that this mosquito can fly. So if you put them within 200 meters, 300 meters, the mosquito can cover that area, and the epidemic continues. There is no change in the epidemic, really. So yeah, they are going to freak out because the mortality rates are much higher, and yellow fever also comes in cycles. At least along the African coast in South Europe as well, it comes in cycles. It comes in 1823, then it comes again in 1829, 30, then again in 1837, then again in 1845. So you have cycles, cyclical epidemics, and you can see, actually, you can read this. There are medical practitioners in European medical practitioners in Africa, which are already predicting we are about to have a yellow fever epidemic. They can see it in 1830 and 1837. They are predicting this epidemic to come. So it is a terrible disease that is going to provoke quite a lot of anxiety on people. But I think that to answer your question, it's not only that; it's also that the yellow fever is going to serve as one of the two main arenas to discuss contagionism, which is something that Alex and I were actually talking about before we started. Contagionism being the main medical issue of the time when it comes to diseases that could be transmitted from one person to another. And there was a camp of medical practitioners that claimed the diseases were not contagious, and others who said that yes, they were, and they got to extremes. And I actually discussed this in the book. There is a surgeon, the surgeon of the HMS Civil in 1830. He drinks a pint of black bile, black vomit from a patient of yellow fever who died soon after. And he drank it in front of the whole crew just to show people that it was safe to be nearby a patient with yellow fever, which of course it wasn't. But it was not because he would drink, because it would be transmitted by drinking the vomit. You still need to be bitten by a mosquito.
Thank you so much. I really look forward to reading the book soon. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Manuel. We have more questions here. Then let me just see who is the next. I think that is Mary Ellen Curtin. And Mary, I have your question in the chat, but do you want to ask this orally?
Sure, please. Yes, please.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to see her. I want to see her if possible.
Hey, Manuel, how are you?
Hey.
I cannot keep up with all your books. I haven't read this one yet, but you've written too many.
Here is one of my co-supervisors, people.
So it's wonderful to see you. Fantastic. Such an interesting and timely book. Thank you. And yeah, my question, I really appreciate your effort to disrupt ideas of progress here, because clearly we haven't seen enough. And especially today when there's such a insistence, especially in the United States, on either denial or of the reality of the pandemic, or the insistence that nothing is more important than this thing called the economy, right? And, you know, no matter how many people die or whatever, like this is what's more important is the economy. And so I'm just curious if there was ever any moment, right, at this, with all of the suffering that you encountered, right, where it was enough for people to say, maybe we shouldn't trade today, you know, like, you know, maybe we shouldn't sail today. Maybe, you know, this isn't worth it. And if those conversations ever took place, and if so, what impact did they have? And, you know, or is this always just something that needs to be contained or dealt with, but it's never enough, right, to really threaten the economics of the trade, whether legal or illegal?
Thanks, Mary.
Yeah.
Well, the discussions happen. They happen constantly. There are people complaining all the time, like we are landing these Africans here, and then we have epidemics. What are you going to do about this? This happens. It happens all across Atlantic, but as per usual, the economic side of things prevail. So what do the authorities do? And this is going to come to all of you as a shocker. They pretend they do things to stop the pandemic, not that they're really doing things to stop the pandemics or the epidemics or whatever. So they establish quarantines that very often don't work. They police how people behave. This is a great opportunity for social engineering. Having a disease is threatening you is a great opportunity for social engineering, for telling people what to do and what not to do. Do not have sex. Do not walk under the sun. Do not drink too much. Do not eat too much. I mean, all these things are happening. And drink coffee, which I would have been fine with. All these things are happening at the same time. But I think that the key to your question is that this is a moment, and I'm going to go back to the 19th century and stop talking about Boris Johnson and Trump, which is what I'm doing right now. This is a moment in which abolitionist discourses are also confronting anti-abolitionist discourses, right? And disease is going to become one more argument for those who want to abolish the slave trade, and they are going to make use of it substantially and consistently as, look what you're doing. White people are dying because you keep bringing enslaved Africans here, and so on and so forth. And you can see this discussion on both sides of the Atlantic. It's quite common, actually. It never stops the trade, but it does become a central argument in these discussions. And authorities are pretend they're going to give the impression that they're doing things, because giving the impression that you're doing things sometimes work. Actually, it's just as useful as not doing anything. But it's kind of they call the pill and they get away with it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. We have another question. Thank you, Mary, as well. We have another question from Diana Hernandez. Diana, do you want to ask your question orally? Just
Sure.
unmuting yourself. Okay, thank you. I will add you here.
Thank you. So how hard was it for you to access health studies of the time? Because I researched the tuberculosis pandemic of the early mid-20th century in Texas, and I'm encountering many obstacles in obtaining access to the necessary archives, from the public health department to all of our archival repositories, even though it's been like more than the 50-year mark. I'm encountering so many obstacles. I was wondering, how easy was it for you to access your health studies?
Thanks, Diana. On the American side of the Atlantic, remarkably easy, actually. Archives in places like, at least my experience in the United States, in Cuba, in Brazil, they can be tricky. I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to mention archives in particular, but they can be tricky. In Europe, funny enough, sometimes they are more problematic. And here I'm going to mention, because I feel that I have to. For instance, in the Spanish archives, you cannot do photocopies. Not photocopies, sorry. And you cannot take pictures of documents. Even now, you can't. Even if you want to pay, they don't let you take pictures of documents, which makes more sense than taking a document and under the scan. And so on and so forth. You always have these problems to reproduce, etc., etc. Accessing the documents, however, I have that sometimes it's easier than other. For instance, with African archives was a problem to get to the African archives, because it's not easy to get there. For me, it was neither cheap, but I felt that I had to. For instance, there were archives like, I don't know, Angola in particular. I was desperate to go to archives in Luanda, and you have to, you just get on with it. Google Scholar has become very useful. Not Google Scholar, Google Books, sorry. And also, there are quite a lot of databases with newspaper collections, etc., can complement what you find in the archive. But I really don't know what to tell you about the Texas archive. Most of the archives, usually at least in my experience, eventually you get to the documents, eventually, even if you cannot reproduce them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. And we have more questions here. Okay, now we have from Miriam Monpoint. To ask a question, okay, Miriam, are you there? Do you want to ask your question? Hello, Miriam. Okay, the question, I'll see if I can unmute her. Hello, Miriam. I don't know if you want to ask your question. Sorry, no question. Okay, she had a question that was in the chat, but you are going to move, okay, to someone else. Okay, Baldakal, do you want to ask your question orally? Bal?
Sure, ma'am. Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay.
I just went through your introduction of the book, and I find it awesome. Thank you so much. I just get connected through Twitter. Alex tweeted about it, and I just came to the Zoom. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I haven't read your book, but I will. I'm very excited. I'll read it very soon. I mean, in a couple of days. I just have a question about human rights. I don't know whether this really gets connected to the book, but just like they have traded the people from other parts of the world to their country. And now, if I talk about them, they are one of the great people who talk about human rights all the time. But while trading the people, did they think about human rights, or where was human rights at that time, at that scenario?
Yeah, thank you very much, Val. Well, I think that there are quite a few studies that have come out in the past few years that actually illustrate this notoriously. And I want to mention this one. It just came out by Bronwyn Everill, and her book is, I think it's entitled Ethical Capitalism, I think. And she actually discusses these issues in length, to a length that I don't. But to answer your question, there have been a discussion among historians in the past few years as to what extent European abolitionism was or can be defined as a human rights movement. There is a book by Jenny Martinez about the mixed commission courts, which actually argues that much. But we also have quite a few colleagues claiming that this is a bit too much, and the reason for that, among other, I mean, you can put forward quite a few arguments against this, but the first one for me, which is I think I mentioned it in my talk, is that abolition, whereas abolition forces are going to improve and going to actually save the life of hundreds of thousands of Africans, there is no other way of putting it. It is not a completely, it is not an enterprise that is devoid of ambition. And this ambition actually has to do with colonial expansionism. It has to do with the access, you know, free trade is like a god in the 19th century, especially after 1820. And it has to do with accessing new markets in an advantageous way, right? They want everybody to do free trade with them, but it has to be done on their terms, which means that they are beneficial to them, right? And if you don't do free trade with me, I impose it on you. It's pretty much like that. And of course, this is going to lead to quite a lot of quite a few conflicts along the coast of Africa, also in the Americas. And the archetypical example of this conflict that free trade provokes is the Opium Wars in China. And this is happening all across the world. This is not limited to a slave trade. It's widespread across the planet at the time, right? So to answer your questions, yes, there is an angle here where you can argue that the rights of these Africans are to a certain extent going to be respected. I mean, they are going to get back their freedom to a certain extent. Some of them are going to be relocated to the British Caribbean or to other parts of the world as indentured laborers, which is not that different from slavery, if you think about it, indentured servants. And you know, there is also the argument that while the rights are being kept in mind, they are also not being given options as to what they do to do with their life. So it is a contentious issue by all means. It's a contentious issue, and I think that more stories will come out, and like the one Bronwyn Everill, that will take on decision in the future. But it's not what I'm actually working on, but I take your point.
Thank you, Manuel. I have a few questions for you. I don't see any question right now. And folks, I know that some of you have general questions, but let's try to stay with questions that are really related to the book. Then I know that some of you have questions that are more broad questions regarding the Atlantic slave trade, but the goal here is to discuss the book. Manuel, and you correct if I am wrong, because I read the book, but you still have to do a second read, then more in detail, because I first look at it just to find references that I was looking for in terms of a research that I'm doing. Then I read for the book club, but one of the elements that I can see here is that, of course, you are dealing with these records of the 19th century, and there is a reason for that. One, because the 19th century is a period that is not much studied, especially because we are talking about the illegal slave trade, whereas the legal slave trade is better documented. Now, I would like to ask you, it gives me the impression that you have this perspective that you covered, then not only the British, but the Portuguese, the Spanish, and this is great. But of course, as you were talking about the illegal slave trade, and the British were the ones who were fighting then to end the slave trade, and they have these records. It gives me the impression that you learn much more about what is going on, even among the other nations who are still involved in the illegal slave trade. We learn much more through the British. Now, my question would be, because this is not a topic that I touch, what we can learn from the French records, from the Portuguese records, from then the records that we can find in the Americas, in terms of the volume of information for this kind of study. Do you think that is accurate to say that most of what we can learn comes from this? From the British? And if not, or if at least we have from the others, are there any differences in terms of how these different nations, they approach the fight against disease that are visible for you? Or because you refer to a number of things in terms of cooperation and all this, and of course, then that there were exchanges, but do we have here any sort of national approach that they are having regarding the ways that they are fighting disease in this period that you are looking at?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Anna. Well, they do have national, if you want to call it. I'm not sure national is the right term for that, because we're talking about empires, colonies, and everybody has a different take. They all seem to have the same and yet different approach, which is, I know best. So each and every one of them thinks that they know better than the others. And therefore, whatever measures they are taking are the right measures to be taken. And then they are sharing this knowledge with each other. I take your point about the British. Well, you know, it's the project I'm working on right now about the suppression of piracy across the world is exactly the same. The British are the leaders, and everybody else join one way or another, or oppose them, one of the two. For instance, I can tell you that the Spanish, the French records, for instance, the Portuguese records, they also record information about the struggle against disease, but they are quite limited. I actually, for instance, I'm going to use the example of the Portuguese because I think it's a perfect example. I work, just as I work with the records of many of the British ships, I work with the records of the ships of the Portuguese anti-slave trade squadron, right? Each and every one of them. I went through all these records. Mm-hmm. And this jumps out of a page constantly. It's everywhere. But it is quite interesting because it's mostly about what is happening to the crew of the ship, not so much what is happening to Africans. And the reason for that is obviously that they capture many less ships than the British do. And the same happened with the French, even though at some point they outnumbered the British in West Africa. And the same happens with the Brazilians along the coast of Brazil, or the Spanish in the Caribbean, which captured one ship in, 40 years. So the British are the ones who are coming into contact with these people, and the British are the ones who are confiscating correspondence from the slave traders. The British are the ones who are talking to them and asking them questions. And so this information is mostly British. I actually realized that also it has to do with buying power, as British Archive have actually managed to buy information, documents from French sources, American sources, African sources, and they are in British archives. Even when they are produced by these other nations, they are still in British archives, which is quite convenient for me, I have to say. Sorry. And
no, of course.
It used to be easier when I used to get in a train and go to archives, you know. Now it's not so easy. But yeah, it's the point that I'm trying to say is that whereas they are going to exchange knowledge, they are always going to be talking to each other. The Portuguese, the British, the French, they are going to talk to each other. They are going to collaborate with each other. They are going to collaborate with the slave traders as well. They are going to collaborate with the African. That is a constant project. This is a common enemy, right? This is the only common enemy they have, right? Regardless of the side you were in the slave trade, or as I like to call it these days, human trafficking in the 19th century, you would still have one common enemy. And it makes sense for all of them to come together and help each other and occasionally even to take care of each other in a fight against this common enemy. The funny thing, to be honest with you, and I know that I already said this before, is that we are not doing that today. We should be all working together towards defeating the common enemy we have. And somehow we find ways to be fighting over other things. And this is quite frustrating when you're a 19th century historian and you see people who were terrible, terrible human beings, still, you know, saying, you know, it makes sense to cut the deal here. Let's work with these people.
Great, great, thank you. Then this clarifies a lot, and I would have 3 more questions, which I will not ask right now, but I will just see if other people then have questions.
I think Diana has the issue. Was yours a version of Diana's? Because I think Diana follows right on this one.
Okay, Diana has another question. Then I will spotlight Diana here, and you can just go ahead and ask.
Thank you. So I was just wondering, from your research, what role did the newspapers of the time have in shaping the narrative around this disease? It's just interesting to me because, for example, tuberculosis, the newspapers of the time shaped this narrative of it being a Mexican disease. So it's not seen as a common enemy for that time period. So I just think it's very, I'm just very curious as to what the newspapers, what kind of role they had in shaping that narrative.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Diana. Well, the newspapers are actually going to have a huge influence. And this is going to happen mostly in Europe and in the Americas, not so much in Africa because they don't have newspapers in Africa at the time. There are very few, if any. But newspapers are actually going to offer a platform for these discussions to take place, and they are also going to help shaping not only public opinion but policies as well. So the newspapers are actually going to be the front line in turning these lines of hygiene into boundaries of rule, as I said before. They are going to justify the bombing of Lagos in 1851. They are going to justify the expansion of what's the capital of Liberia? The expansion of Monrovia into the hinterland from the 1820s onwards, and they are always going to be able to justify this as if, you know, there are usually, actually there is one main reason behind all this, is civilization. You know, we are going to civilize people and all that, and it's a very positivist discourse that is taking place at the time, and it's going hand in hand with this idea that civilization and free trade are going to make people prosperous. You are talking here about you know, there was this idea, as you know, in the 19th century, the goal of everybody was to be happy, and they are going. Free trade is going to become center for this, and free trade is actually going to become the main justification for imposing these discourses on other people. Some newspapers are going to carry this these ideas, and newspapers are going to carry this message, and they are going to actually change the way people are thinking of these things. Having said that, newspapers are also on occasion, because for instance, in a place like Britain in the 19th century, there are all kinds of newspapers. There are different angles, and they are going to also fight it. So there is a silver line there.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Manuel. I don't know if there is any other question. Otherwise, I will jump with my questions. Then let me just see here, what do I have? Okay, one is a very specific question, Manuel, that I don't know if you can have your take on this. I see it in the book that there are a number of instances where you discuss the Loango Coast and Cabinda and Luango in particular. Then I am working on a project on the slave trade in this area. And one of the elements that appears in other works that published and unpublished refer to it is the fact, of course, that that many of these slave traders, first, they were not able to build forts on the coasts of these ports because they didn't have the permission as they had on the Gold Coast or in Ouida and so on. This was one element. The second element is that many, according to the contemporary sources, references to the fact that slave traders, ship captains, and so on, that they would prefer to sleep in their own ships than because the justification was because of the health conditions, that they would be afraid of the diseases. And when I was showing this to a colleague, historian Mariana Cândido, she made how can I say, an observation that afterwards I also found elsewhere, that indeed this was one side of the story, but indeed that they were afraid of being attacked by locals and so on. Then I would like to know from you if you have any evidence from your research that they were doing that because of fear of disease. This is one element. The second element that appears in your, then it's tangential to what you are doing, that is this issue of the Middle Passage and some of these ships that arrived where there was sexual violence during the Middle Passage and so on. And I would like to ask you to you in terms of the gender dimension of this, how disease operates then among enslaved people then during the Middle Passage, in the barracks and so on. And if we see any kind of gender approach by the slave traders and so on, or if you could see from your research any elements that differences here between how enslaved men and women are treated regarding disease, they appear. Then of course, reproduction is one of the elements, but I would like you to explore that, because, and it's also, of course, diseases that are transmitted through sexual, then through sexually transmitted.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to start with this one, if you don't mind. Okay. Well, there is a main reason why gender is not central to this book, and it's precisely because of slave traders, and even actually those who seized the Africans and then free them in their parts, they never had this as a central issue in the mind. So you have to dig deeper to find this information. I hope that I actually show a bit of this in the book, but it would be a study in itself. But to answer your question, I really think that there is a dimension here that has to do with, of course, sex and women. We know, we have plenty of evidence, not only from the 19th century, we have it from visually every decade, if not every year. Women are constantly subject to sexual, rapes in the transatlantic slave trade, before, during, and after. We have plenty of evidence from almost every voyage. I think that there is something that we don't talk a lot about it, but I suppose that also men were subject to, I'm pretty sure men were also subject to rapes in the Middle Passage. And you have to think here that about, slave ships 40 days at sea or longer, which very often were only carrying men. As a matter of fact, as you know, we at least have one case, well-documented case in which children were raped, the Jesus Maria, in 1841. So this was a terrible business. It's stuff that is hard to read and hard to make sense of today, right? But women, I think that if you look at, of course, there is not a single slave trade. There is not a single approach to how to deal with the people they are trafficking. Some slave dealers, some human traffickers are going to even have harems in their, that Francisco Félix de Sousa, as is harem in Huida. They are going to have their own I don't know, their own approach to women that differs from others, right? In other cases, they are basically not going to pay attention to the fact. I know, for instance, I was looking quite a lot to a couple of places in the coast of Africa in which there is basically no men and women are put together, they're chained together, they discuss things together, they work together. I think, for instance, Rio Pongo in West Africa, this is one of them. So I would say that yes, there are differences, but they are not consistent. They are not always there. You cannot always see them. The only thing that I actually think that is consistent here is sexual violence, and the fact that sexual violence also, of course, is going to lead to disease, and not only sexually transmitted diseases, other diseases as well. I mean, being beaten, being raped, this actually can weaken you when there is another contagious thing, infectious disease on board, or in a barracoon or whatever. So of course, it's a given in that case. To answer your first question, I don't know a lot about Luango, but I can tell you that slave traders in the 19th century are going to choose to sleep on the ships because of the diseases. Of course, they realize that, and there is a whole narrative about this. The closer you get to the green hills of a place like Freetown, the most likely you are to die. And there is a huge discussion, and again, here I have to touch on COVID again, about fumigation, ventilation. Ventilation is one of the main discussions at the time. There are references to the African breeze, to the sea breeze as the doctor. The sea breeze in West Africa was referred to as the doctor. So that tells you how much they appreciated being offshore, being far away from those hills. So that's an element. But there is also the element of, as you say, that they could be attacked. That's, of course, a reason they could be attacked by people from the places they were coming to exploit. And there are cases in the 19th century. I'm actually working on one in what is today Gabon. And there is a third element, which I think that is probably the most important one of the three, at least the most relevant for this period. And it is that as long as they are in the ships, they can take off if the British or the French or the Americans show up. And if they are on land, it's more difficult for them to escape from the anti-slave trade patrols. I mean, they may escape on land, but they will lose a ship. And of course, losing the ship means losing your business. So I think that there are different elements there, but definitely one of them is related to the relationship with the coast and disease as well, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. And let's see if we have more questions. I have Alex. Then Alex, I will just spotlight you. Here we go.
Yeah, I do have one from the heart, like I said earlier. So the only reason I'm asking this is because I see you not reticent to make connections between your work and some of the things that we're experiencing today. In the book, you dedicate several passages and episodes to Sierra Leone and Liberia. We're just talking about some of this right now. And I'm thinking of the Ebola outbreak, what is it, like 5 years ago, 4 years ago?
5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, 5 or 6. And when I was reading the book, this kept coming to my mind that some other practices that actually contributed to the fear of the World Health Organizations and Doctors Without Borders, etc., could be traced to some of these perhaps cultural reflexes. And I might have been influenced by the fact that I just read, Anna's book about how some of these things, survive in the ways they survive. But also there were more specific, kind of like empirical things, right? That, for example, we know that Ebola themselves was connected, at least some of the outbreaks, to the way that burial practices was still using water to bury the body. And I was just wondering, just gonna put it out there, to see if what were some of the most clearly empirical connections that you could make between the 19th century and some of the things that are happening, in the 21st century, if you came across, they provoked you in some ways.
You mean thanks a lot. You mean on top of what I already said?
Right. No, it's just such a fascinating subject to me, because that was me reading the book, just thinking about these things.
let me see. Well, on top of honestly now, on top of what I already mentioned, I think that there is quite a lot, and it's the fact that Africa, and this is something that unfortunately continues to happen. Africa is always described as this. First of all, it's described. I think I actually quote someone in my book that says that Africa is usually referred to in dualistic terms. It's always white and black, dark and light. All these things are always related to Africa. If you look at Hollywood, African religions are always diabolical, or they worship the demons, and all these things are, of course, in the public psyche, and this is especially for the case for people who haven't been to Africa. Once you set foot in Africa, unless you are an unrepentant bigot, you realize that this is not the case, right? I remember my first time in Africa. It was the first place I went outside Cuba. I went for a while to Senegal, and I remember the days before going, everybody was telling me, "Are you sure you want to go?" Including my parents. Everybody would tell me, "Are you sure you want to go to Africa?" It's unwise. And I still see this, I still see this when I talk to people. There are a lot of assumptions in the Western psyche, in the Western mentality that equal Africa to a place where bad things come from, or bad things can happen to people, right? And this is, to answer your question, this is something that I see in the 19th century clearly in the sources, and is still here today. Something else that I continue to see very clearly is also how the contributions of Africans and the Africans continue to be diminished. For some reason, but to be honest with you, this is not only with Africa and the Africans. I mean, the Chinese can make a contribution to science today, and probably we have to wait for the Western medical doctor to say the same thing, and then you say, yeah, let's wear face masks. I mean, the Chinese have been using face masks in SARS back in 2001, and it seems to work for them. So, but no, we are going to wait until one of us actually says it, and then everybody starts wearing masks. And these things, unfortunately, are ingrained in who we are in the Western Hemisphere. And I don't want to start ranting against the Western Hemisphere. It's not my style anyway. That's not what I believe anyway. But I think that there are things that are deep within our psyche, and it is very difficult to disassociate us from that. And Ebola was the perfect storm to fuel these fears again, these anxieties again about how Africa can infect us, etc., etc. And this is a funny story, because if you think about it, only a few years before we have had the H1N1 fever, better known as the swine flu, which started in a farm, I think it was in Arizona or Arkansas. And yet, we never call it the Arkansas fever, I'm gonna leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Manuel. Thank you, Alex. Who else do we still have any other questions? I don't see any hands. Then this is the time for you to ask a new question. If you don't want to use this time to ask a question, I just would like to conclude with Manuel with to asking you about the transition from this project to the project that you are doing now on piracy, And if you want to just give us then an overview of what you are doing then with this new project, where you are. Of course, now you have been locked because of the pandemic, but we would like to know more about the new project as well.
Yeah. Well, this is actually quite a serendipity sort of project. About 3-4 years ago, I started doing an admin job, or a leadership job, as we call it now, for my university, for my faculty, and I started traveling the world. And when that happened, I had started to think about how European powers in the 19th century started to suppress piracy, and I use piracy within inverted commas because many of the men, women, and children who are going to be involved in this act of piracy are going to be forced to do so precisely by European expansionism, but by this free trade that put them out of business of whatever they were doing. But I was looking at the Atlantic because it was my comfort zone, as you can imagine, and a little bit at the Indian Ocean. But as I started doing this job, I realized that I was coming into contact with new archives in different parts of the world. And suddenly this new universe opened up, and I started reading about China, and I started reading about the Mediterranean, I started reading about the Gulf, the Southeast Asia. I started retaking Dutch, which is something that I'm very proud of. I have been boasting about it on Twitter recently. I'm so proud that I can actually read Dutch, 19th century Dutch. And all this actually kind of fall into place. And it's basically a project that seeks to understand how different peoples in these different places reacted to these impositions of free trade, which also sometimes were accompanied by colonialism. Say the case of Borneo, for instance, with James Brooke, or the case of Hong Kong with the Opium Wars, etc., or the Gulf Coast with the attacks of 1809 and 1819, and this all actually became quite an organic project eventually. And I'm looking pretty much at the strategies and both the resistance strategies, but also the ways in which these other peoples were portrayed in Western media and literature as well.
Wonderful. And
to
are
justify what they were doing. Yeah. Sorry.
And what period you are looking at?
Oh, always the same period. I haven't settled yet. I'm looking mostly 1825 to 1867, 1870, because it seems to be a chronology that fits most of these areas pretty nicely. I mean, 1867, for instance, is the end of the sort of the unofficial end of the transatlantic slave trade, but it's also the end of the British protectorate of the East India protectorate in Singapore, in the Strait settlements, Singapore, Penang, and also it's a period where all these events that I'm describing that took place. I mean, the attacks in the Gulf, also the attacks to the Moroccans in Northern Africa, the transatlantic slave trade. Everything is happening at the same time, and this is a period I'm very comfortable with right now. So.
Yeah, then this is a true global history, because we do Atlantic. Sometimes we call this global. It's not really global, but now it is. Yeah. And we have, thank you so much. We have a question from Tatiana. Tatiana, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, Manuel. It's not really a question. I just wanted to encourage you to think about doing the Philippines for your piracy.
Oh, I am. I'm doing the Philippines. I'm actually waiting for the National Archive of Madrid to send me the copies of all the documents that I requested. I was supposed to go there back in May, but of course I couldn't go. And I was planning to go to the actual Philippines, which I always wanted to go anyway. But then I discovered that all the colonial records of the Spanish colonial occupation of the Philippines are in the CSIC in Madrid as well.
Well,
I may end up going to both places at some point, but for the time being, Madrid is easier. Okay, I think.
I'm going to email you some citations.
Yeah, please do.
Great. Okay, folks, I don't think we have anybody else who has a question or a comment. We are already moving to the next project. That's, who knows if you are still there by then. We can we can do a Slavery Archive book club with the new project. For those who arrived now or who are watching on YouTube, today we are discussing the newest book by Manuel Barcia, titled The Yellow Demon of Fever, Fighting Disease in the 19th Century Transatlantic Slave Trade. And I want to call your attention that our next book club is going to be in December. Alex, I don't remember when. It is December the 10th. Let me just check here, folks.
I'm checking right now.
Okay. Yes, it's December the 9th. And this is going to be with historian Richard Bell. This is a book from last year. And the book's title is Stolen: 5 Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery and Their Astonishing Odyssey Home. It's the focus is the United States, but it also deals with the legal slave trade, but now of people who are indeed born free or who are people who were freed in the Americas. And these 2 boys, indeed, the 5 boys, indeed, they were free people. Then I thank you everybody who came today, and I hope that you continue joining us. We have a full schedule for 2021. Otherwise, for those who are in the United States, I wish you a good Thanksgiving and I hope you stay safe and masked and isolated. For those who are elsewhere, take care of yourselves and come back. And again, thank you, Manuel, for this great book and for joining us today. For those of you who missed the beginning, you can always catch the entire thing on YouTube. Thank you.
Gracias, Manuel.
Gracias.
Chao.
Thank